They were designed to be the best. They met enemies face to face, endured tragedies and enjoyed victories. They went down in history due to the bravery of their crews. They are the ships that deserve to be called naval legends.
In February 1942, Japanese aircraft attacked the city of Darwin in Australia. Japan was expanding its empire, mainly by occupying territories in Southeast Asia. Though Australia was not part of their plan, military bases of the United States and the Allies stationed on the Green Continent were undermining Japan's intentions to dominate the Pacific, and the Royal Australian Navy was actively involved in the Pacific War until the very end of World War II.
Following the end of the Second World War, moving into the Cold War, Australia still realized that it needed to have a defensive asset in its Navy, so it moved to bringing in a new generation of vessels, of which the Daring-class destroyers were a member.
The Daring-class was essentially designed as the Royal Navy's super destroyer. Australia decided to build 3 Darings, being Vampire, Vendetta and Voyager.
Total displacement, about 3,800 tons. Length, almost 120 meters. Beam, a little over 13 meters. Draft, 4 meters. Armament. When commissioned, the Darings were equipped with versatile guns, featuring the best rate of fire in the world. 6 113mm Mark V guns mounted in 3 dual turrets. As for small caliber anti-aircraft guns, the ships had 6 40mm Bofors autocannons. Torpedo armament. 1 5-tube 533mm torpedo launcher. Anti-submarine armament. 1 3-barreled 305mm Mark X anti-submarine mortar. The power plant consisted of 2 Foster Wheeler boilers and 2 English electric turbines and provided 54,000 horsepower. Maximum speed over 30 knots. Cruising range 3,700 nautical miles at 20 knots. In the early 1970s, the Darings were fitted with surface-to-air missiles. Despite this, they remained mainly artillery ships, and they were the last ones of their kind. The destroyer's main turrets were their pride. 113mm versatile guns could fire 24 rounds per minute and showed themselves to be advantageous during World War II. The Darings were equipped with a QF Mark V version of these guns, which was a post-war upgrade.
This is the gun bay, or gun turret A on the Daring-class destroyers. This is where the shells and the cartridges were assembled before being sent up to the guns. This is an incredibly challenging and very dangerous place to work on the ship. It was confined, and as you can imagine, you've got high explosives being sent into this room, so there was the danger of explosion or fire. And if that weren't difficult enough, this bay actually rotated as the gun above rotated. Sometimes the rotation would occur without any warning and any indication of where it was going to go. So you could be in the middle of trying to assemble a shell, and all of a sudden the entire bay would move and you'd have to shift with it.
Essentially the only vessel which saw service out of the class was the Vendetta, which did a short period of time in Vietnam.
An Australian contingent of about 50,000 men participated in combat operations in Vietnam, and Australia got involved in this war several years before the United States interfered in the conflict. At first, 30 Australian military advisors were sent to South Vietnam, but a couple of years later, a several thousand-strong military force was deployed there. They required supplies, which were brought by transport convoys from Australia. Darings were among the ships protecting them. Despite the fact that Australia was officially at war, it was hardly felt aboard escort ships. Of course, the service wasn't anything like a pleasure trip. However, one of the major concerns for the destroyer crews was to win the Gloucester Cup, the main award for naval exercises.
I think the amazing thing about Vampire was that it was an extremely happy ship. And I think that was because there was a lot of trainees on board, and the atmosphere there was, give everything a go. Don't worry about it. Just get in there and do your best.
The Darings were a top ship. They were a very friendly ship, or especially Vendetta was. Everyone in the crew used to get along together. There was hardly any ever fights.
However, any joyful existence can be darkened by tragedy. This is a fact of life, and cheerful Australian sailors didn't manage to escape it.
Unfortunately, the Australian Navy lost the Voyager in 1964 with a large loss of life.
On the 10th of February 1964, HMAS Voyager, one of the Daring-class destroyers, was struck by the aircraft carrier HMAS Melbourne during maneuvers off Jervis Bay, New South Wales, Australia. The ship was hit just after the bridge, and it broke in half and rolled over.
I don't think that the Voyager's crew was poorly organized. I don't think that the Melbourne's crew was poorly organized. It was an accident. Something got overlooked, and a sequence of errors led to this collision.
Sitting there, being on Vendetta, they sat there and were always told, there is escape point 1, escape point 2, go down this way. If we get sliced in half, and you start going down, go up, sit there, know where all the escape point was. And that's how we done it.
One of those to die aboard the ship was Chief Petty Officer Jonathan Rogers, who was too big to fit through the escape hatch, but helped other crewmen get through the escape hatch before he led those who were still stuck in the ship in hymns and prayers as the ship sank.
This tragedy left a deep wound in the hearts of Australian sailors. But soon their life returned to normal. Exercises, regattas, and patrol duties. Many veterans remember their years of service aboard the Australian Darings as the best and most carefree time in their life. Friendly and well-knit crews of the Daring-class destroyers were very highly trained and were rewarded by the command of the Royal Australian Navy on multiple occasions.
It's not easy to serve in the Navy, but they were young. They were happy. They accomplished some tasks. Yes, he swabs the deck, but then he will go ashore. He will be a sailor. He will be in the spotlight.
As a junior recruit, like leaving school in the morning, joining the Navy in the afternoon and then sent to Lewin, all in the same day. The Royal Australian Navy to me was life-changing. Sit there and set me on my career, and I've never looked back. It was the best 12 years of my life I ever spent. I'd actually wish I'd done it to 20, or even longer, but it was just such a good camaraderie on the ship. That's why life is great on 08.
In the 1980s, when new wave music began conquering the world, the Australian destroyers from the rock and roll era became history. Voyager and 83 members of her crew rested at the bottom of the sea. Vendetta was scrapped.
She was scrapped. She was sent there and sent to Taiwan and basically ended up as a razor blade, all the steel. She was, I wish they'd sat there and sunk it as a reef, but they weren't sinking ships back then for reefs. There was still money in steel.
Luck was kind to Vampire alone. She was decommissioned in 1986, but remained intact. This museum ship, located in Sydney's Darling Harbour, has the right to be considered a memorial to all Australian darings. She is the last of them.
And all the parts that went off Vendetta are now on Vampire, which is the museum ship you just looked at. There's probably, I'd say there's a good 40% of Vendetta still floating on Vampire.
So I'm very glad that they saved HMAS Vampire from the scrap heap, because she does represent an era of the Navy of which I'm very proud. The privations of steamships and the great spirit of the crews.
The collection of the Queensland Maritime Museum in Brisbane includes a remarkable exhibit, frigate HMAS Diamantina. This humble ship can be rightly called a unique monument to an important part of the world's naval history. That's because she is the last remaining representative of the River-class ships, which became famous for their contribution to the Battle of the Atlantic in World War II. At the beginning of the war, the convoys carrying vital supplies to Great Britain sailed from the USA and Canada virtually unprotected, and very often fell prey to German U-boats. Only in the 200-mile area near the British Isles, the so-called Western Approaches, screening ships met the convoys and escorted them to British ports.
They needed a ship built especially for the sole purpose of protecting transport convoys. This type of ship wouldn't bombard coastal defenses or fight against enemy surface targets. It would only engage German U-boats and protect transports in a convoy.
It wasn't long before a project was developed that met all the requirements. The ship had a great cruising range and was so different from the vessels that usually escorted convoys that the Admiralty brought back a term from the era of sailing ships, the frigate. As the majority of ships were named after British rivers, the entire series became known as the River class. Specifications of the River-class frigate HMAS Diamantina. Length, almost 92 meters. Beam, more than 11 meters. Draft, 4 meters. Displacement, 2,200 tons. Armament. Primary armament, 2 dual-purpose 102mm Mark 16 guns. Anti-aircraft artillery, 3 Bofors guns, caliber 40mm. 4 Oerlikon guns, caliber 20mm. Anti-submarine armament, 4 depth charge rails, and 150 depth charges in storage. The main power plant consisted of 2 triple expansion steam engines that produced 5,500 horsepower. Maximum speed 20 knots. Cruising range more than 5,000 miles at 12 knots.
The initial actions of German submarines were mostly individual. They acted on their own. But when convoy protection was reinforced, when the Allies constructed many special ships to escort transports, the Germans had to invent a way to overcome their defenses. That's when they devised the so-called wolf pack tactic. It worked like this. A U-boat discovers a convoy. The flagship that commands a wolf pack or a system of wolf packs transmits the order to other U-boats to move to that area. And those U-boats start to gather to intercept the convoy. Lots of them.
Diamantina was fitted with a Type 271 radar, which actually played a pivotal role in changing the course of World War II. Its major role in the protection of convoys was its ability at night to detect the submarines on the surface as they approached the convoy to attack the convoy.
The radar could only detect a submarine if it was on the surface, but they usually surfaced just prior to an attack.
Unfortunately, warships in World War II were unable to detect torpedoes that had been fired, and they relied entirely on lookouts picking up the track of the torpedo as it approached the ships. And because of the propulsion system used by most of the torpedoes, they could see a line of bubbles coming to the surface.
Well, I can only relate a training experience when Murchison was exercising with British submarines, and I was given the task of looking for the torpedo bubbles. But when I sighted the bubbles, and by the time I reported them to the captain, the bubbles are now on the other side of the ship. So his words to me were, "Signalman, if this was a real war situation, we would be now manning the lifeboats."
Even if a ship managed to dodge torpedoes, thanks to the vigilance of signalmen, it was difficult to retaliate because the submarine swiftly disappeared from sight. Having launched torpedoes, submarines dived, and they could only be discovered with the help of a special device, sonar.
Near the bow of the ship, just close behind us here, is a black dome, and that is the sonar dome fitted to these ships. And the sonar is a bit like a torch beam, which is projecting a sound signal out into the water and hoping to get a reflection back of something like a submarine. And that sonar equipment is directional, and so where it's pointing, where it's looking, where it's sending the beam out is under the control of the operator. And that was one of the vital sensors that these ships had for detecting submarines.
A frigate's captain had to deal with the shortcoming of sonar when planning a counterattack against a submarine. It lost contact with the target at a distance of about 140 meters. Thus, the captain had to guess the possible course of the submarine and direct his ship straight towards it. At the end of April 1943, after a week's storm-filled cruise, convoy ONS-5 was intercepted by a wolf pack. The convoy's screening ships, including several River-class frigates, repelled the attacks of about 40 submarines for several days. 13 transports were sunk. The German submarines had the advantage until the 5th day of battle, when the convoy entered a stripe of dense fog. In a single moment, hunters became prey, betrayed by the bright markings on radar screens of escorting ships. In the impenetrable haze, the British frigates competently found German U-boats and attacked them.
For combat against a submerged submarine, the ship carried over 100 depth charges in its depth charge magazine, and these were large cylinders full of explosives that they would either roll off the stern or launch out from the side of the ship in a pattern set at different depths to try and explode around the submarine and close to the submarine, and either to crush the submarine or force the submarine back to the surface.
There were two ways to drop depth charges on River-class frigates: from rails on the aft and with the help of K-gun throwers installed on the ship's sides. The simultaneous use of these two methods increased the effective area and probability of damaging a submarine. The Hedgehog mortar launcher was another anti-submarine weapon of the River-class. It fired 24 30-kilogram bombs ahead of a ship. A salvo from a Hedgehog covered an area of more than 30 meters in diameter. The system was effective, but unreliable at first. That's why depth charges remained the primary anti-submarine weapon of River-class frigates. At the time when, in the Northern Hemisphere, the grandiose battle for the Atlantic reached its turning point, Walker's Limited shipyard in Maryborough, Australia, laid down frigate HMAS Diamantina. By the moment of her launch, the Atlantic was basically clear of German submarines, thanks in no small part to British River-class frigates.
Diamantina has, in my mind, three claims to fame. First of all, she is the last Australian warship to fire a shot at the Japanese in the Second World War. The second claim to fame was that the Japanese garrison at the islands of Nauru and Ocean Island in the Pacific actually surrendered on the quarterdeck of this ship. And the third claim is that she's the last in the world of this class of ship.
In the 1980s, the ship was honourably decommissioned and placed in a comfortable dry dock at Queensland Maritime Museum in Brisbane. Now the bright Australian sun warms the deck of the last ship from the River-class, a family of small ships that struck terror into German wolf packs in the Northern Atlantic.